Elijah Roberts woke up early in the morning, feeling a slight sense of excitement. This day was a milestone in his life. Since childhood, he had dreamed of a career in investments, diligently pursued his studies, graduated from a prestigious university with honors, and earned an MBA. Despite his young age, he already embodied a rare combination of determination, humility, and a high level of knowledge, which had earned him a position at Forest Point Finance, one of the leading players in the financial services market. Elijah understood that today he was stepping into a new professional reality, where every move would be closely scrutinized. Elijah decided not to inform his colleagues about his family background. His father, Richard Roberts, was the CEO of the company, but they had mutually agreed that this information should remain undisclosed in the workplace. His father always emphasized the importance of personal merit, so Elijah wanted his colleagues to see him as a specialist, not as the CEO's son. For him, this was an opportunity to prove that his professional competence was the result of his own efforts, not nepotism. On his way to the office, Elijah pondered the challenges ahead. Forest Point Finance was known not only for its high standards, but also for its internal competition. This was a firm where each employee strove to get ahead, and anyone who fell behind quickly became an outsider in the team. From the outset, Elijah knew he would face bias, both overt and subtle, considering that he was not only a newcomer, but also a young black professional in a company dominated by older white colleagues. The corporate culture he had observed consisted of strict conservative rules, and he knew he had to fit in without losing his own identity. When he entered the company building, he felt like an outsider. Forest Point Finance was located in a prestigious business center with modern glass facades, where every detail of the interior conveyed status and sophistication. Spacious lobbies with marble floors and austere leather chairs created an atmosphere of luxury and constant motion. Feeling slightly uncomfortable, Elijah tried to maintain his composure despite his inner tension. Every step down those long corridors reminded him that there was no room for weakness here. When he reached his workspace, he looked around the office. Against the light, almost sterile walls, expensive paintings and minimalist furniture stood out. The workspace was organized with a cold rationality, reflecting the company's overall style. Silence reigned, interrupted only by the occasional phone ring and the sound of keyboards. The whole team appeared deeply absorbed in their work, creating an atmosphere where newcomers could easily feel like uninvited guests. Elijah wasn't the only new employee in the office, but as he looked around, he noticed that his presence attracted more attention than he had expected. His colleagues, while trying not to show their interest, were covertly studying him, occasionally exchanging glances and brief comments. Some of their gazes felt too intense, the kind he had seen many times before. A mix of curiosity and hidden criticism, tinged with a lack of understanding and expectation. He felt that his appearance and skin color set him apart from the others, amplifying his sense of loneliness in the new team. On his desk was the company's branded laptop and a stack of documents for review. Before starting his work, Elijah skimmed through these papers, trying to understand the department's structure and the specifics of current projects. Despite his readiness and high level of knowledge, he knew that his boss would be the key factor in his career here. Soon, Victor Shelby, his immediate supervisor, entered the office. Victor was a tall man with sharp facial features, an insightful gaze, and an expression that conveyed skepticism and superiority. He was always impeccably dressed, his strict suits and shiny cufflinks highlighting his status and authority. From the very beginning, Victor made it clear that he viewed Elijah with distrust. As an experienced manager, he was accustomed to analyzing and noting details in people, but this time his gaze was cold and perhaps overly critical. Elijah felt Victor's evaluative stare, but tried not to pay it much mind, continuing to carefully review the documents and prepare for the upcoming work. Within an hour of working, it became evident that Victor regarded Elijah as an outsider. He didn't bother to introduce him to the team or explain the current projects. On the contrary, It seemed that Victor wanted to show that Elijah was just a newcomer, not worthy of special attention. Victor passed by his desk indifferently, as if Elijah were just another figure in the office, deserving neither respect nor even curiosity. This created tension, and the feeling that Elijah had to prove his worth with every step. Elijah felt he was in a place where even minor details could play a significant role. He knew he faced a difficult battle, not only against professional challenges, but also against the bias he felt from Victor, and even some colleagues, just as he was beginning to work. This first chapter symbolized a challenge for him. He understood he couldn't expect support and had to rely solely on his own strengths. But despite the initial difficulties and sense of alienation, Elijah was full of determination. He knew that his success or failure would depend on his professionalism and patience. In this cold, strict office, he intended not only to endure, but also to prove that he deserved his place. By the first week, it became clear that Victor Shelby had no intention of making life easier for his new subordinate. Each day began with Victor assigning Elijah difficult and unappealing tasks, clearly lacking significance, but requiring meticulous attention and time. His approach seemed deliberate. He gave Elijah no chance to prove himself in more meaningful work, confining him to minor tasks that ultimately held no importance. Elijah realized that these assignments weren't helping him grow or learn. Instead of being involved in major analytical projects or working with clients, he had to compile reports, check minor figures, and update outdated data in the corporate database. Victor seemed particularly focused on keeping his work in the shadows. Every time Elijah tried to ask about the essence of the projects or how his task fit into the bigger picture, Victor would give him a stern look and briefly respond that such details were not for him to know at this point. After a few days, Elijah began to notice that even in communication, Victor maintained a distance. While he might exchange a few words or discuss the latest financial market news with other subordinates, with Elijah, his tone remained cold, and conversations were dry and limited solely to work matters. This aloofness not only put Elijah in an awkward position, but also intensified his feeling of being viewed as an outsider. One day, Elijah witnessed a small meeting where Victor and a group of analysts discussed the department's main strategic goals. After the meeting, Elijah approached Victor to ask about the department's upcoming tasks and how he might contribute. Victor looked at him with irritation and said that before asking such questions, he should focus more on his current duties. He reminded Elijah that he needed to earn the right to be part of the team before thinking about anything more. Every word of Victor's confirmed that, in his eyes, Elijah remained nothing more than a temporary employee. This feeling was especially intensified when Elijah saw his colleagues receiving far more interesting tasks. Other newcomers, who joined the company around the same time as him, were starting to work on their first projects, meeting with clients, and participating in presentations. Elijah noticed how they were given more attention, with their mentors readily answering questions and sharing experiences. For him, however, the situation was quite the opposite. He felt isolated, as though his skills and ambitions were deliberately ignored. Victor seemed to enjoy emphasizing his superiority. He chose phrases and a tone that demonstrated his arrogance and left no doubt that he saw Elijah as merely an insufficiently competent novice. Rumors circulated that Victor preferred working with those he deemed promising, while the rest, in his view, weren't worth his time. This especially affected Elijah, and though no one in the office dared discuss it openly, he felt the judgmental and suspicious glances of his colleagues, as if they were trying to figure out how such an unremarkable intern ended up at such a prestigious company. Additionally, Elijah began noticing subtle signals indicating that he was viewed with prejudice. When he arrived at the office in the morning, he was hardly acknowledged, whereas Victor's other subordinates were given at least some minimal attention. One colleague once told Elijah that Victor just needed time to assess him and that Elijah would have to earn his trust by proving his professional suitability, but behind those words was something more, as if it wasn't just about skills. Meanwhile, Victor continued to stick to a rigid approach. Each day, he assigned Elijah tasks that were simple in nature, but presented as if they held some special importance. Elijah had to correct endless reports, format documents for secondary clients, and create schedules based on outdated data. At morning meetings, Victor spoke in a cold, neutral tone, making it clear that Elijah's opinion didn't interest him. Another week passed, and Elijah noticed his patience beginning to wear thin. He realized that Victor had no intention of giving him a chance to showcase his strengths. Outwardly, he remained composed, but inside, he increasingly felt that he was under constant pressure. He was surrounded by a team where no one seemed to care about him, and his skills and knowledge seemed to evoke nothing but irritation from Victor. He recalled his father's words that everyone builds their own reputation, but now these words seemed especially challenging to apply. Elijah tried not to show his emotions or allow himself to complain. He saw how his colleagues treated him and how they kept their distance, likely to avoid falling out of Victor's favor. In this isolation and biased attitude, he felt a familiar sensation, the realization that he would have to put in more effort and prove his competence despite the prejudice, simply because he didn't fit the usual image of a company employee. A few weeks passed, and Elijah began to realize that his position in the department was becoming increasingly challenging. Victor, it seemed, never let up, constantly adding new assignments that required meticulous accuracy, but didn't allow Elijah to showcase his analytical abilities. Elijah felt as though incredible patience and resilience were expected of him, but it was becoming harder and harder to endure such pressure. He sensed that Victor was deliberately keeping him under tight control, almost as if waiting for the moment when Elijah would lose his patience and leave on his own. Every morning, Victor would start the day by unemotionally explaining Elijah's tasks, using a strictly formal and detached tone. Complex tasks always went to other, more promising employees, while Elijah continued to be burdened with routine operations. Victor carefully avoided any opportunity for communication beyond Elijah's assignments, which only heightened the feeling that he was intentionally distant. This approach created a cold and hostile atmosphere, making it increasingly difficult for Elijah to stay focused. But the hardest part for Elijah wasn't just completing these tasks. It was the complete lack of support from his boss and colleagues. Victor never expressed any appreciation, even for the rare assignments that Elijah completed, especially thoroughly and quickly. Any work he did was simply taken for granted, and even if he performed flawlessly, his successes went unnoticed. In these conditions, Elijah felt that his efforts weren't valued or taken seriously, which only deepened his sense of isolation. Victor continued to use his position to emphasize his superiority. Every time Elijah finished another assignment, Victor indifferently noted that he could have done it better or faster. These comments, while not overly harsh, dealt subtle blows to Elijah's confidence. Gradually, he began to feel almost invisible, as if his contribution to the work held no importance. One day, during another morning meeting with the entire department present, Victor presented a report on which Elijah had mainly worked. However, he didn't even mention Elijah's involvement, taking full credit for the success himself. Elijah kept his disappointment hidden, trying to maintain his composure, but inside, he was boiling. He realized that this report could have been an opportunity for his professional recognition, but Victor likely ignored his contribution deliberately, leaving him with no chance to stand out. Despite the lack of acknowledgement and constant pressure, Elijah didn't give up. From the beginning, he knew that the work environment would be challenging and understood that he would have to work several times harder to prove his competence. For him, this became more than just a job. It was a kind of test, a trial of resilience. He started coming to the office earlier and staying late, aiming to improve his productivity and show Victor and the whole team that his abilities went beyond routine tasks. However, it seemed Victor anticipated his every move. When Elijah began completing his tasks faster, Victor increased his workload, each time finding additional assignments that required even more time and attention to detail. Sometimes these were duplicate checks or tasks that others had already completed, but Victor always found a reason to assign them specifically to Elijah. The situation was becoming unbearable. The more effort Elijah put in, the more obstacles arose. Each week, Elijah watched as his colleagues advanced in the department, received recognition, and were assigned more interesting projects. He understood that he was in constant comparison with others, and this comparison was never in his favor. Rumors circulated among colleagues that Victor intentionally put people in their place if he felt they didn't meet the company's high standards. For Elijah, this meant he would remain under close scrutiny until Victor was convinced that he posed no threat to the usual order in the department. It was clear that Victor viewed him as a temporary employee and therefore sought to shield him from serious tasks. Yet at the same time, Elijah sensed that there was more to this than just a difference in qualifications. His desire to prove himself and get a chance to participate in meaningful projects met a wall of misunderstanding and distrust, backed by a subtle hostility and prejudice. Gradually, he began to realize that his position was not only a professional barrier, but also a manifestation of hidden racial bias. Elijah increasingly felt that his patience and resilience were being tested. Over the next month, the pressure from Victor Shelby reached a new level. Every task assigned by Victor came with a subtle, barely perceptible hint of disdain. Victor never made outright remarks suggesting that Elijah didn't measure up, but this opinion was evident in every word he said. His tone was always neutral and cold, intensifying the feeling that Elijah was nothing more than an unwelcome presence to him. One day, Victor summoned Elijah to his office for a conversation. It was a spacious, luxuriously furnished office with panoramic windows overlooking the city's business district. Silence filled the room, broken only by the occasional sounds of the keyboard, as Victor finished his work before addressing Elijah. Sitting behind an enormous wooden desk, he looked stern and focused, making him seem even more unreachable. His gaze was cold, and when he lifted his eyes to Elijah, the weight of that piercing stare made Elijah feel as if Victor were trying to read his thoughts and intentions. In this conversation, Victor made it explicitly clear that, in his view, Elijah didn't meet the company's standards and was unlikely to blend in with the team. Without unnecessary emotion, he said that certain qualities were valued in the company's corporate culture, and although Elijah was trying, he still seemed out of place among the other employees. Victor didn't state this openly, but the undertone was unmistakable, and Elijah understood it perfectly. It was as if Victor was reminding him that the company valued a certain type of worker, those who fit all the parameters, both professionally and socially. Every word from Victor seemed designed to press down on Elijah, emphasizing his otherness and vulnerability. This conversation stirred a mix of conflicting emotions in Elijah. On the one hand, he realized that Victor was openly asserting his superiority, and on the other, his anger mingled with despair. He knew he could handle tasks as well as his colleagues, but the sense that Victor was deliberately blocking his progress left him with deep dissatisfaction and frustration. After this conversation, Elijah understood that he was unlikely to receive even minimal support from Victor. He also began noticing that some colleagues were increasingly avoiding him. Although initially he thought they were simply busy with their own tasks, he now saw that many who had previously been cordial were distancing themselves. Victor was using his authority to shape the team's opinion, and his disdain for Elijah was gradually spreading to the other employees. Elijah could no longer rely on his efforts being recognized or valued. It was as if he were in isolation, where his hard work was taken for granted, while any mistakes, on the contrary, were highlighted with particular attention. Victor kept him under tight control, and any deviation from perfection in his work immediately became a subject of criticism. And all this was done under the guise of professional correctness, leaving no room for open conflict. Yet this only motivated Elijah further. He knew he wasn't here to quit at the first challenge, and he was determined not to give Victor any reason to see him as weak. Every day he arrived at the office a bit earlier, stayed later, and strove to complete each task flawlessly. He understood that his efforts might not bring immediate recognition, but he believed that his diligence and resilience would ultimately allow him to overcome this trial. Nevertheless, an inner conflict was brewing. Alone in the office, he increasingly questioned whether it was worth continuing to work in a place where he was not valued. Thoughts of leaving arose more frequently, especially when the tension peaked. Each day he faced the fact that his achievements and successes went unnoticed, and this became truly painful. The feeling of his own invisibility within the company, where others were easily moving up, reminded him of the insurmountable barriers Victor had placed in his path. Elijah realized that he was now at a crossroads. His decision to stay or leave the company had to be carefully thought out. He understood that by leaving Forest Point Finance, he could escape the unfairness and prejudice, but at the same time, he knew that leaving now would seem like he was proving Victor right, who from the very beginning had considered him unfit. This inner conflict became a true test for Elijah, forcing him to reevaluate his goals and priorities. After a month of endless routine tasks, Elijah finally got the chance to work on a more significant project, when Victor assigned him to prepare an analysis for an upcoming meeting with major clients of the company. It was an important project, one whose quality would reflect on the entire department's reputation. However, even with this assignment, Elijah realized that Victor was still setting hidden obstacles. The task appeared simple, but it quickly became clear that Victor had intentionally complicated it, providing Elijah with incomplete data and leaving important questions unanswered. Victor gave Elijah no clear instructions on the report structure and withheld information about the client's requirements. When Elijah tried to clarify the details, Victor responded evasively, claiming that he should know such things if he aspired to professionalism. It seemed as if Victor was deliberately creating conditions for Elijah's failure, forcing him to rely on intuition and take risks to produce a quality report. Elijah worked diligently on the project, analyzing the data with utmost precision and trying to fill in the gaps using his analytical skills. He knew that the success of the presentation now depended not only on his efforts, but also on proving to everyone, including Victor, that he was capable of handling real challenges, despite all the difficulties. The project became more than just a task. He saw it as an opportunity to make his mark in a company where his persistence and abilities had so far remained unnoticed. Every day, staying late in the office, he immersed himself in work, double-checking every number and reaching out to colleagues who sometimes helped him with additional data, even if they themselves didn't understand why he was working alone. For Elijah, it was a real marathon that required not only knowledge, but also resilience. He knew that making a mistake would mean confirming Victor's assumptions about his so-called lack of competence. On the eve of the meeting, Elijah finally completed the report. Despite the tension and exhaustion, he was confident that he had done everything possible to make the project high quality and professional. For the first time during his time at Forest Point Finance, he felt genuine pride in his work. This project embodied his efforts and determination, and now all that remained was to see how his work would be received by the management. However, during the presentation itself, something happened that seemed to shatter his hopes for recognition. Victor, who was leading the meeting, presented the report to the clients but didn't mention that the main part of the work had been done by Elijah. He presented the report as if he had prepared it himself, proudly highlighting its accuracy and in-depth analysis. Elijah sat in the room, listening as Victor took all the credit, and felt a growing sense of disappointment inside. He realized that Victor had no intention of giving him a chance to stand out, even if the project turned out to be successful. At that moment, Elijah began to feel the weight of the injustice he had faced throughout his time at the company. His achievements were intentionally ignored, and his work was treated as something to be taken for granted, as if his contribution lacked value. Victor was not only demonstrating his disdain, but actively blocking any attempt Elijah made to gain recognition, as if the success of an intern would undermine his own competence. After the presentation ended, Elijah noticed that a few senior managers had taken note of the report, and one even nodded approvingly in his direction. However, Victor quickly redirected their attention to himself, discussing future work with the client and explaining details as if it were all his own accomplishment. Elijah understood that his efforts remained in the shadows, and this imposed sense of insignificance weighed heavily on him, making him question his future at the company. Nevertheless, the desire to overcome these obstacles continued to burn within him. He realized that every step he took was being watched not only by Victor, but also by those who might be starting to notice his work. Elijah resolved firmly to keep fighting for his place, despite his boss's biased attitude. He knew that this struggle wouldn't be easy, but he believed that his hard work and perseverance would ultimately allow him to break through this wall of prejudice and doubt. After several more weeks, Elijah began to notice that his work was causing increasing irritation for Victor. Despite completing all his assignments flawlessly and often exceeding expectations, Victor only became stricter and even colder. He seemed unable to accept that Elijah was handling his duties competently, and so he constantly looked for new reasons to criticize him. Elijah began to feel that every mistake or slightest deviation from standards would be used against him. One morning, as soon as he entered the office, Elijah received a message from Victor asking him to come by his office. This was rarely a good sign. Victor seldom spoke to him directly, and when he did, it was usually only to give a reprimand. Elijah walked to Victor's office, feeling a slight apprehension and preparing for another round of veiled criticism. Victor was seated behind his large desk, carefully reviewing some documents, and didn't even look up as Elijah entered. When Victor finally looked at him, his eyes showed cold indifference, mixed with a hint of superiority. He began by emphasizing that the company required not only high productivity, but also flawless adaptation to the corporate culture, hinting that Elijah was failing to meet his expectations. His words, though outwardly neutral, were laced with subtle barbs. Victor stated that colleagues were unhappy with Elijah's methods of work, and suggested that perhaps Elijah should consider whether he truly fits this company. Elijah felt a surge of indignation rising within him. He knew that all his reports and projects were completed with precision and attention to detail. He also understood that while colleagues kept their distance, they had no real reason to complain about his professionalism. His work was always done on time, and even those few colleagues who dared to work with him directly occasionally offered praise, albeit discreetly. But Victor gave him no chance to defend himself. He underscored that Elijah's position in the company might be temporary if he couldn't meet the high standards. This implication was clear. Victor was openly hinting that he was ready to let Elijah go if he found enough grounds. Each subtle hint, every cold word pushed Elijah closer to the realization that Victor was literally searching for a reason to fire him. After this conversation, Elijah left the office feeling a mixture of anger and disappointment. He knew he had worked with complete dedication, but all his efforts seemed only to deepen Victor's hostility. Victor was intentionally undermining his confidence, creating an atmosphere of constant tension and making him feel unwelcome. Every step, every decision now felt like it was under Victor's close scrutiny, as though any action could be the final straw. In the following days, the tension grew even more. Victor assigned him projects that were technically complex, but set unrealistic deadlines. He was always quick to point out that top-level professionals don't allow delays, making it clear he wouldn't tolerate any delays. Elijah worked almost non-stop, striving to meet every deadline, but the pressure was mounting. Each morning, coming into the office, he noticed the way his colleagues looked at him. They seemed to understand that he was in a difficult, unenviable situation. Some of them might even have sympathized with him, but no one dared to openly show support, fearing Victor's disfavor. This atmosphere of solitude and alienation weighed heavily on Elijah, turning each morning into a tough ordeal. He noticed that his colleagues, despite their reserved and even friendly expressions, avoided close interaction with him. They didn't want to witness his difficulties and refrained from intervening, fearing that supporting Elijah might cause problems with Victor. Elijah gradually realized he was in isolation, and this estrangement added even more challenges for him. Each evening he returned home exhausted and drained, but he didn't allow himself to consider giving up. He knew this was a test of resilience and was determined to prove that he could withstand the pressure and show everyone that he deserved to be part of the company, despite his boss's biased attitude. The situation between Elijah and Victor continued to escalate, and Richard Roberts, the company's CEO, couldn't ignore it any longer. He had been watching his son's career closely, knowing that Elijah was working under conditions that demanded not only professional skills, but also immense patience. However, to allow Elijah to truly prove himself, Richard chose to keep their family connection a secret. Yet, he understood that if nothing was done, the situation could spiral out of control. So, after carefully weighing all factors, he decided to intervene and scheduled a meeting, inviting both Victor and Elijah. On the appointed day, Elijah and Victor entered the spacious office of the CEO. Richard's office was both strict and elegant, a large dark wooden desk, high windows letting in soft light, and a few paintings on the walls that added an atmosphere of calm and strength. Richard greeted them with a polite smile and invited them to sit across from him. He appeared composed and attentive, ready to discuss a difficult matter, but with no hint of aggression or bias. After a brief introduction, Richard asked Victor a question that, at first glance, seemed simple, but was not without undertones. He inquired how Victor assessed Elijah's work, and whether he had any comments or suggestions regarding Elijah's professional development. Richard tried to maintain a neutral tone, so as not to reveal his personal interest in the situation. Victor, feeling confident, narrowed his eyes slightly and leaned forward. His voice carried a hint of irony as he stated that Elijah barely manages, and that his work left much to be desired. With a smirk, he added that, in his opinion, the company could find a more suitable candidate who wouldn't cause so much unnecessary trouble and would fit more naturally into the team. Victor deliberately chose words to cast Elijah in a negative light, unaware of how closely Richard was connected to the matter. Richard listened to Victor with a calm demeanor, remaining composed and focused. However, internally, he felt rising irritation at the way Victor spoke about Elijah with such disdain. The pause Richard maintained after Victor's words was intentional. It allowed Victor to realize that his statement might not have been received as he had expected. Then, Richard slowly but confidently responded that in fact he saw Elijah as a highly capable employee, demonstrating professionalism and resilience. Calmly and steadily, Richard added that he found it hard to understand why Victor viewed Elijah's work in such a negative light and suggested he consider possible reasons for their tense relationship. And then, almost as if in passing, Richard uttered a phrase that changed everything. "Besides, Elijah is my son." The words were spoken calmly, but their impact was profound. Victor froze. The self-assured expression on his face vanished, replaced by shock and confusion. He suddenly realized the situation he had brought upon himself, and that his disdain and covert discrimination toward Elijah could have serious consequences for his own career. It dawned on him that his reputation now depended on how Richard, the CEO, and, as it turned out, the father of this less suitable candidate, judged his behavior. A tense silence filled the room. Victor tried to pull himself together, but his voice faltered as he spoke of a misunderstanding and his attempts to support a young professional. However, Richard, maintaining an icy calm, did not react to Victor's justifications. He succinctly concluded that Elijah was meeting expectations, and any further doubts about his professionalism would be treated with the utmost scrutiny. Elijah watched the scene unfold, feeling as if a weight he had been carrying since he started at the company had finally been lifted. His father's words made it clear to Victor that every move from this point forward would be closely monitored. As Victor realized that the situation had turned against him, he felt the loss of control over the circumstances. Richard ended the meeting, leaving Victor in a state of deep unease, forcing him to reconsider his management methods. Elijah left the office understanding that he now had the chance to work freely, without the constant pressure from Victor. This meeting marked a turning point. Now he knew his efforts were seen and valued, and any future attempts by Victor to undermine his position would not go unnoticed. After the meeting in Richard's office, Victor realized that his position in the company had been seriously undermined. He understood that even the slightest attempt to justify himself in Richard's eyes would appear unconvincing. For the first time in many years, Victor felt a real threat to his career. His confidence and authoritarian approach to subordinates could no longer serve as his shield. Richard had made it clear that corporate standards were more important to him than the personal ambitions and biases of individual employees. The next day, Victor was summoned to the HR office. He was informed that the company would not tolerate behavior that undermined its principles and culture. Violations of corporate ethics and disrespect toward colleagues provided grounds for his dismissal. Although Richard understood that this decision might not be easy for Victor, he felt no hesitation. Fairness and corporate values remained more important to him than personal preferences and status. After receiving notice of his dismissal, Victor made a desperate attempt to defend himself, trying to convince the management that his actions were not malicious, that he was merely upholding strict standards of employee evaluation. He claimed that his criticism of Elijah was solely driven by a commitment to quality work, but HR and Richard were steadfast. They emphasized that Victor's management style not only conflicted with the company's values, but also undermined the team's morale. Rumors of his dismissal quickly spread throughout the office. Employees who had endured his harsh management methods and arrogance for years felt mixed emotions. Some were surprised, as Victor had always seemed untouchable, a leader whose authority was nearly unquestionable. But now, even the most distant colleagues could see that the company was not afraid to uphold its values, regardless of individual achievements. When Elijah learned of the company's decision, he felt relief, though not schadenfreude. He understood that Victor had created his own fate, and this decision was not an act of revenge, but a matter of justice, upheld by Richard and backed by the company's entire corporate policy. Elijah felt that his efforts and patience had finally been recognized, that he now had the opportunity to work without the constant pressure and prejudice from his boss. In the days that followed, colleagues, having heard about what happened, began to see Elijah in a new light. They understood that he had not only withstood a difficult situation, but had also shown resilience and professionalism. Many quietly expressed their respect, and some even approached him openly to offer support and congratulate him for enduring the challenge. Victor's dismissal sent a strong message to the entire team. The company clearly defined its stance. No achievements or personal ambitions could justify behavior that violated principles of respect and professional ethics. This incident reminded everyone that no one was above the established standards, and that the company valued each employee, expecting everyone to adhere to moral and professional norms. Victor left the company with a profound sense of defeat and emptiness. His confidence, authority, and drive for control, once his strengths, had turned against him. He now realized that his approach to management had not only damaged his relationships with subordinates, but had also led to his downfall. This lesson became significant not only for Victor, but for all other employees in the company. Victor's dismissal brought an atmosphere of change to the company. Employees who had once feared his sharp remarks and constant scrutiny now felt relief and even a sense of inspiration. In the department, where a tense silence once reigned, friendly conversations and a sense of support among colleagues began to emerge. The news that the company stood firmly by its values gave people confidence that their contributions and efforts were truly appreciated. For Elijah, this moment was a true turning point. He felt that the weight he had carried since starting at the company had finally lifted. Now he could focus on his tasks, without constantly looking over his shoulder for anyone's biased opinions. His reputation as a reliable and diligent employee had been validated by the leadership's actions, earning him well-deserved respect among his colleagues. Even those who initially viewed him with caution now saw him not merely as a newcomer, but as someone who had proven his resilience. A few weeks later, Richard invited Elijah for a personal meeting. This time the atmosphere was entirely different, relaxed and even somewhat friendly. They met in Richard's spacious office, where Elijah felt much more at ease than at their previous meeting when their family connection had been revealed. Richard expressed his gratitude to his son for his resilience and professionalism, noting that his behavior had not only demonstrated character, but also strengthened the company's culture. He explained that he had been following the situation's development and was proud that Elijah had not succumbed to Victor's provocations, choosing instead to remain focused on his work. Richard added that he looked forward to Elijah's continued success in the company and assured him that his door was always open if Elijah had any questions or ideas to improve work processes. Listening to his father, Elijah felt a deep sense of gratitude. He realized that these months of challenges had made him stronger and more confident in his abilities. Now he saw opportunities instead of obstacles. The company had become not just a workplace, but a place where he could grow and develop, knowing that his efforts and ambitions would be recognized. As time went on, Elijah became more actively involved in strategic projects, with his approach to work and attention to detail catching the attention of other managers. He not only completed his tasks, but also brought fresh ideas and found innovative solutions to problems, which strengthened his standing in the team. Elijah was gradually transforming from a newcomer to a valuable employee whom others consulted and turned to for advice. A few months after Victor's dismissal, the company held its annual meeting to review the year's results and recognize employees for their achievements. When Elijah's name was called among those who had made significant contributions to the company, the room erupted in applause. He stood on stage, slightly surprised by the support, and paused for a moment, realizing how much he had overcome and how far he had come. This was the moment of recognition he had been waiting for, though he hadn't realized just how meaningful it would be to him. After the meeting, colleagues approached him to congratulate him and express their respect. Many now saw Elijah not only as a colleague, but as an example of resilience and patience. He understood that their recognition was well earned, and this gave him the motivation to continue working to the best of his abilities. This journey, full of challenges and perseverance, had made him more confident and prepared for future trials. Watching his son, Richard knew that Elijah would keep moving forward, discovering new horizons and becoming the leader he had always envisioned. He felt that over the past months, his son had grown not only professionally, but also as a person capable of inspiring others through his example. For Richard, this was the greatest confirmation that his approach, allowing Elijah to walk this path on his own, had been the right one. Elijah looked toward the future with confidence. New horizons and opportunities lay before him, things he couldn't have imagined when he first started at the company. He knew that ahead lay both successes and challenges, but he was ready for whatever came his way. In his heart, he carried the conviction that he could overcome any obstacle, for he had gained something that couldn't be bought, the experience of resilience, integrity, and inner strength.